All right, so picking up where we left off, we have yet another theory of intelligence. So this is Sternberg's triarchic theory. And Sternberg believed that there were three kinds of intelligence, and that's where we get the word triarchic from. So there's analytic, creative, and practical. And overall, he believed that the definition of intelligence was the ability to achieve one's goals in life within a socio-cultural context. So this is important because he's bringing in a social aspect to the idea of intelligence. So overall, his theory requires capitalizing on strengths and making up for one's weaknesses. So each of us has strengths and each of us has weaknesses, and to be an intelligent being, we are using them to kind of give us the advantage. So we'll talk about each type of intelligence, each aspect. So the first one is analytical, and you can think of this as like book smarts. So this is what we typically think of when we think of intelligence. Most exams are getting at analytical intelligence, most standardized assessments, this kind of thing. So it's the ability to break problems down into component parts or analysis for problem solving. And like I said, this is measured by most intelligence assessments and academic achievement tests. So they're pretty academic in nature. And analytical intelligence predicts GPA and vocational success. So an example of a way to test for analytical intelligence would be pretty much any exam you can think of. So like I said, this is what we usually think of when we think of intelligence. This could be a multiple choice exam, maybe a short essay to an extent that has a pretty standard correct answer. The second aspect to intelligence for Sternberg's theory is creative intelligence. So here you see we're starting to expand from our kind of average typical view of what intelligence means, and we're getting more into the social aspect. So creative intelligence is the ability to deal with new and different concepts and to come up with new ways of solving problems. So this is very divergent thinking. So different questions you might use to assess creative intelligence, or different types of assessments, maybe like creative writing assignments, maybe even a performance assignment. So allowing an individual to display that aspect of their intelligence. And then the last part to Sternberg's triarchic theory is practical intelligence. So this is what people are talking about when they say something like street smarts, the ability to use information to get along in life and become successful. Knowing how to be tactful, manipulate situations to one's advantage, and use inside information to increase one's odds of success. And practical intelligence predicts success in life, but it doesn't really predict, and it's not really related to academic intelligence. So if you want to think about this in like an extreme example, could be the type of person who maybe didn't do too well in high school, maybe dropped out of high school, that kind of thing, but then winds up becoming a CEO, an entrepreneur, doing amazing and successful things in life. So that would be a very extreme example of this to help you kind of understand the concept. So ways of assessing this aspect of intelligence would be trying to get at someone's problem-solving ability. So an example from your textbook would be giving a question about, what would you do if you were in a dispute or an argument with your roommate? How would you resolve that? Maybe a picture of somebody walking into a party and they looked kind of confused, like maybe they don't know anybody there and they're not sure what they should do. So how would you navigate that situation if you were exposed to a new environment where you didn't know anybody? So those would be ways to kind of get at and assess practical intelligence. So like I said, 3 parts to intelligence here. We have analytical, which is like your book smarts, what we're normally looking at when we look at intelligence, but Sternberg is taking it out even further by adding more sociocultural type aspects with the creative intelligence, which is like storytelling, performance, creativity, that kind of stuff, and then practical intelligence, which is like street smarts, problem solving, thinking on your feet, that kind of stuff. So Sternberg used the Rainbow Project to assess his theory of intelligence. And this was the first phase or first version of the study. And it used 1,000 students, college students, who were applying to attend the university that Sternberg was employed at. So he added different components to the typical application process. So normally when a student, I'm sure you can remember when you applied to tech, when a student applies to a university, they may take like the SAT or the ACT, or if they want to be in grad school, the GRE, that kind of thing. And then we're also looking at maybe GPA, which is also heavily reliant on more analytical intelligence, right? So we're definitely looking at book smarts typically for the average applicant. And Sternberg wanted to take that a step further and also incorporate other parts of intelligence when looking at a potential applicant for a university. So he wanted to test individuals' creativity and practical abilities. So he added these questions to get a more well-rounded view of the potential applicant. And he found that by adding different types of questions that are getting at these different types of intelligence, there was a better prediction of college performance. So creative and practical questions or assessment added to the typical analytical assessment increased the prediction of first-year GPA from 9.8% to 19.9%. And it also increased diversity on campuses. So an example of this would be Native American students are typically very good at storytelling and typically have higher levels of creative intelligence. And this type of assessment allowed them to use those abilities in order to display their intelligence. So. And I have here a TED Talk by Sternberg, so if you have the PowerPoint open or you can download it from Moodle, you can watch that. It's pretty interesting. So the next thing that we will be talking about is IQ. So intelligence quotient, originally termed by William Stern as intelligence quotient, which was German. And there is a formula here. It's an individual's mental age over their chronological age times 100. So what do I mean by mental age? What do I mean by chronological age? What does this stuff mean? An individual's mental age is their performance level. So if we imagine we have, say, a 10-year-old come in to take an IQ test, so this would be an ability test, which is looking at someone's ability, what they're capable of, rather than an achievement test, which is looking at what they've achieved thus far, what they've learned in school, that kind of thing. So those two are very different. So you have a 10-year-old come in, they're taking an ability test, an IQ test, and they score at the age of a 12-year-old. So they're more intelligent than those that are their same age, than their peers. They're as intelligent as the average 12-year-old, basically. So your formula would be 12 over 10 times 100. And that would give this individual an IQ of 120. So if you see on our bell curve there, that's about a standard deviation and a half above the mean. So they're doing better than roughly like 95, 98% of their peers. So this child would be pretty intelligent, although we'll talk about later when 30 and above would be considered gifted. So IQ, the definition is that it's a number representing a measure of intelligence resulting from the division of one's mental age by one's chronological age and then multiplying that quotient by 100. So IQ is assumed to be normally distributed around a mean of 100 with a standard deviation of about 15. So what does that mean? A mean of 100. So that means that the average individual has a score of 100. So the average person will score 100 on their intelligence quotient on an ability assessment, with about 50% of people scoring below that and 50% scoring above that. So that's what that means overall. Okay, so Binet and Simon. This is a test question. So Binet and Simon were French, and they developed the first IQ test in 1904. And the reason for this was a law was passed in France for universal education. So because of this, they needed to identify children for special education classes. And there needed to be some form of assessment in order to parse out which children needed to be in special education and which children could be in the regular classroom. Okay, so they developed the Simon-Binet scale of intelligence, and over time, Terman at Stanford University in the United States took this assessment and kind of tweaked it a little bit, updated it, and now we have the Stanford-Binet scales of intelligence that are still used today. So like I said, this was to identify students with special needs. It's used to predict school performance, and the IQ formula, or the intelligence quotient, is used to determine one's score. And the Stanford-Binet scales are used today, the 5th edition. I do want to note that not a lot of people use the Stanford-Binet scales of intelligence. So there are a few main versions of different ability assessments used today. The Wechsler system is very, very popular, and there are multiple versions of the Wechsler system. For instance, an IQ test for preschoolers, for children, for adults, an abbreviated IQ test. So that would be the Wechsler abbreviated scales of intelligence, the WASI. There's also, what else? A Wechsler nonverbal assessment of intelligence. So this one system kind of has different ways of assessing the construct of intelligence. And the Wechsler system was developed in Germany, and yet it's one of the most popular assessments used in the United States. On the other hand, the Stanford-Binet scales, which were developed in the United States by Lewis Terman at Stanford University, are more commonly used in Europe, which is kind of interesting. They kind of flip-flopped. I've never used the Stanford-Binet scales, but I have peers that have used it, and they don't really like it too much. It's kind of a complicated assessment, is my understanding of each time a question is wrong or right, you kind of have to skip to another question further along in the book, and there's lots of back and forth and that kind of thing. So the Wechsler system is pretty simple and straightforward, and a lot of people prefer to use that. So I wanted to take a second to discuss the timeline of how events are taking place here within intelligence, because things get kind of confusing pretty quick. So we talked about Francis Galton, if you remember. He was in the 1860s, and he believed that intelligence, this latent construct that no one really has a firm definition for, the way he viewed intelligence was sensory. So sensory abilities, someone's eyesight, grip strength, overall strength, the circumference of the head, all of that. And then in 1904, we have the Binet-Simon scale. So that took place in France. They were trying to determine which children needed to be in special education and which children could be in the regular classroom. So they developed this scale of intelligence in the hopes that that would kind of infer a child's achievement ability, if that makes sense. And around this time, Spearman's G was also developed. So that was Spearman that we talked about on Tuesday in class, who also came up with factor analysis, if you remember that. So this would be general intelligence, that kind of concept of this general construct that everything's kind of trying to get at. And then in 1916, we see that Terman took the Binet-Simon scales and tweaked them a bit to develop the Stanford-Binet, which is still used today. around this time, the Army Alpha and Beta tests were also developed. And this was by Robert Yerkes in World War I to test for U.S. military recruits, and it was in group format in order to classify which jobs military members may work well with. And if you remember the name Yerkes, Robert Yerkes, that's because we talked about him like our first class meeting, our first lecture. So the Yerkes-Dodson law of performance, moderate level of stress or arousal leads to optimal performance. So you can see kind of where his research interests lie and how that would make sense looking into performance and arousal in terms of the military and cognition and that kind of thing. And then we have around the 1950s, the late 1950s, Soviet Union and Sputnik and the space race. So the United States was very much interested in identifying school children who may be equipped well for math and science so that those children could be singled out and trained to become future scientists and mathematicians and that kind of stuff. So intelligence testing was pretty important around then. And then in the 1980s through 1990s, we have Gardner's multiple intelligences that we talked about on Tuesday, and then Sternberg's triarchic theory with those three aspects to intelligence. Oh, I do want to note also, the Army Alpha and Beta test was discontinued after World War I. That might be why it doesn't sound too familiar to you. In 1968, the ASVAB was developed to take its place. Okay, so we talked about how IQ is normally distributed around a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So this slide is just kind of going over that again, and that's about it. Okay, so intellectual disabilities. It used to be that in order to be diagnosed with an intellectual disability, what used to be called mental retardation, but was changed in the most recent version of the DSM, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. One had to have scored under 70 on an IQ assessment. So that would be 2 standard deviations below the mean. And that would mean that the individual was diagnosed with an intellectual disability. Now that is no longer a requirement in the DSM-5, so this slide is a little bit old, I suppose. So now, in order to diagnose someone with an intellectual disability, yes, their IQ must be low. There's not a specific number assigned to it, just that it is low, but you also have to have another component, which is low adaptive ability. So cognitive ability would be looking at like that IQ point, and then adaptive ability is looking at an individual's capabilities of living like independently, of taking care of themselves, of remembering their phone number, where they live, how to brush their teeth, all these types of things that we need to do to adapt to our environment to survive independently. So if an individual is low in adaptive ability, which there are assessments that specifically look at that, and also low in IQ, and it's affecting their day-to-day life negatively, and they're not able to function, then that individual can be diagnosed with an intellectual disability. I also want to note, I don't know if we've talked already about this or not, on Class Tuesday, because I'm recording this prior, but to diagnose someone with a learning disability, typically we would give an IQ test or an ability assessment, so like the Wechsler system, and compare those scores to an achievement test. So like I said, ability and achievement are 2 different things. Ability is what one is capable of. Achievement is what one has achieved or learned thus far, schooling, math, science, spelling, that kind of stuff. If there's a discrepancy there, someone has scored high on aspects to intelligence or ability that are correlated with, say, math or science, or correlated with verbal comprehension, that kind of thing. And then scores low on those aspects of an achievement test, then there's a discrepancy between their ability, what they're capable of, and what they're actually doing, what they're performing, what they're achieving. So that means that there's some sort of barrier to learning. That barrier may be poor opportunity for learning, or it could be a learning disability. And then you would get into like different assessments looking at parental data or teacher data and that kind of thing, and get as many variables as possible to paint a nice picture, and you may end up diagnosing a learning disability. If you see the opposite, high achievement and maybe average ability or IQ, the individual may just study really, really hard or work really hard. You don't see that quite as much, but it is possible. They may really, really like to read or something like that. And then gifted. So with gifted, the individual has an IQ over 130, so that's 2 standard deviations above the mean, and that's only about 2% of the population. So when you get into gifted and the actual school system, it can be kind of tricky with giving someone the opportunities that are allotted to individuals who are labeled as gifted. So within the field of psychology, for psychologists, people assessing and diagnosing, gifted isn't an actual diagnosis that you see like in the DSM-5. Gifted is more of something you see within the school system. So school psychologists, that kind of thing, they're the ones who would be more interested in labeling someone as gifted, which a school psychologist is someone with a master's degree. They've gone to school for about 2 or 3 years with specialized training in the school system in particular, and some training and assessment and that kind of stuff. So I've been exposed to this a little bit. I had someone explain it to me one time. Overall, there's this kind of like chart, and if an individual scores over 130 on overall IQ, something like that, they're allotted like 3 points, 4 points, so many points, and that would give them access to a gifted label. Or if they score over 130 on an aspect or subscale of the overall IQ, that gives them like 1 or 2 points, and different things give them a few points here and there, and then they can kind of add up to the threshold of 3 or 4. I don't remember what it is, but there are kind of different ways of getting a gifted label, if that makes sense, which I don't expect you to know that. But overall, IQ over 130 is typically labeled as gifted. And then genius would be IQ over 140, and that's less than half of the population. After 140, it gets very, very difficult to determine someone's specific IQ number. So it's kind of just over 140. When you get into the 150s, that kind of thing, it's not as valid or reliable, if that makes sense. And then you have like Mensa, which is a club you can be in, I think, if your IQ's over 130, if I remember right. Okay, so here's a nice visual of the bell curve of intelligence. You can see this is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the WAIS. So about 68% of the population falls 1 standard deviation below and above the mean. About 95%, 2 standard deviations above and below the mean, that kind of thing. 50% would be right here, 50% below 100, 50% above 100. So if you have an IQ of 100, if you've had an assessment, that means you're average. Like most people have an IQ of around 100. That's average, that's normal, typical. So research shows that intelligence tests correlate well with school performance, but not adaptation to environment. So that would be that adaptive functioning. And creativity is not well correlated to IQ. So if you remember, if you're looking at Sternberg's triarchic theory, IQ is basically what he's talking about with his one aspect of the three parts, analytical intelligence. So analytical intelligence is different than creative intelligence and emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence is also not assessed by IQ tests. Tacit knowledge or unspoken practical knowledge about how to perform a job well, also not assessed by IQ. So with Sternberg's theory, that would be that practical intelligence. So you can see how two major parts, or even three if you want to bring into account emotional intelligence, are not covered by the average IQ assessment. So we're only looking at one part of this big picture of what intelligence is, or a holistic view of an individual. Test scores are highly correlated with social class, so we see that high SES tends to have higher IQ scores, and IQ can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So believing that you have an IQ, believing you have a high IQ can just increase that IQ or keep it around that level. Believing you have a low one, once again, can decrease or keep you at a low level. So it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the stability of IQ, it's fairly stable until about age 60. After 60, there's no drastic loss. Crystallized intelligence declines less than fluid intelligence. So fluid peaks in adolescence, which would be like the 20s, and then it decreases slowly with age, and then declines even more around 30 or 40. And then crystallized intelligence continues to grow throughout adulthood, which makes sense because if you remember, crystallized intelligence is looking at knowledge and facts, and we just continue to grow a repertoire of knowledge and facts as we age and are exposed to more experiences, learn more information, that kind of stuff. So over time, we just build and build and build until we reach the point where we start to develop dementia, that kind of thing, and Alzheimer's disease affects crystallized intelligence. That's where you see the greatest deficits, so those facts and knowledge. Identical twins tend to have more similar IQ than fraternal, so this suggests that there may be a genetic component to intelligence, because if you remember, identical twins are more or less clones of each other, while fraternal twins are more or less siblings. So you see that the closer in DNA that two individuals are, the more similar IQ will be. I believe this is regardless of environment, so twins that are raised separately as well. Okay. So the next reading from your assigned readings for this section is the Pygmalion effect. So this was Rosenthal and Jacobson, and they went into an elementary school and told some of the teachers that some of their students would be late bloomers, and this was evidenced by a valid test of intelligence. So really all they did was randomly pick kids out of these elementary school classrooms and assign them as late bloomers or not late bloomers. This was completely random. All children were given an IQ test in the beginning. This was the TOGA, the test of general ability, so it's a very short, quick, easy, nonverbal assessment of intelligence, and this would be analytical intelligence. And this looks at both fluid and crystallized. So all kids were given an intelligence assessment that could be compared to after the intervention. The intervention being pretty much nothing happening, just the teachers being told that some random students would be late bloomers. So what they found was that after time went on, the children who were labeled randomly as late bloomers, their IQ scores increased. And this was above and beyond their peers. So you would think that there would be kind of an average increase of IQ among all of the students, but no, there was a much higher increase within the students who were labeled as late bloomers. So what's happening here? It seems that the teachers were expecting more of those students, and that resulted in increased performance within those specific students. So our expectations can alter our perceptions and our behaviors. I also want to note that the lower grade levels had the greatest effect. So their IQ points raised the most compared to their peers. And there were a few hypotheses in the book about this, but no known real reason why this occurred. So it could be because they're newer to the school system, maybe they just moved to the area, maybe the teachers of lower class children are different than teachers of upper class children. Lots of different ideas going on there. So basically the Pygmalion effect is this idea of self-fulfilling prophecy affecting our expectations. The Flynn effect. So this was termed by Herrnstein and Morey, and they wrote The Bell Curve, which was a book that was came out in like the 1990s. And the idea here is that IQ test performance seems to be increasing kind of overall over time, and this started around the 1930s. So they've seen since the 1930s that the average individual's IQ has increased about 9 points in fluid intelligence and 15 points in crystallized intelligence. So basically an IQ of 100 today would have been an IQ of 124 in maybe your grandparents' or great-grandparents' generation. So we have more specially crystallized knowledge, if that makes sense. And there could be multiple reasons behind this. There's no known answer, once again, like most other things. So it might be better nutrition, urbanization of society, exposure to new technology, exposure to preschool or daycare, so kids are going to school earlier. Kids have the internet and iPhones and things like this so they can look up anything at any time. They're constantly being given new information, that kind of thing. So there's really no known reason for this, just some ideas. And here's a visual representation of the Flynn effect, if that helps some of you guys. So you can see in 1932 where 100 was, and now in 1997 it's kind of decreased or shifted over time. Okay. So what accounts for ethnic group differences in IQ scores? We see differences in economic status. So like I said earlier, socioeconomic status, those children who are higher in SES tend to have higher IQ points. And there are various reasons behind this, such as they're exposed to more information, probably better schooling, maybe better nutrition, that kind of thing, less stress. So lots of variables going into this. We have test bias. So as far as I know, all IQ tests were written by fairly high SES, definitely high achievement-wise in schooling, that kind of thing, white males. So there may be some bias in the testing. An example would be, some kids from low SES households may not have been exposed to some words that kids from high SES households have been exposed to. So like equestrian, that kind of word. Some kids from low SES households may have never heard of that word. They may not have been exposed to it, and that puts them at a disadvantage, that kind of stuff. And just testing in general, too. So kids from high SES households may be exposed more to testing processes, like having psychological assessments or assessments to get into the school that they're attending, like the elementary school, and then their middle school, and then their high school, that kind of thing. We see heredity versus environment argument, so that might be part of it. Cultural experiences that improve test performance. So an example I have here, which, many of you may have different examples. I have a niece who wanted to attend a nice school in her hometown. Her parents wanted her to go there for, I think this was like first grade or kindergarten, and they knew someone who worked there, and that person said, yeah, it's great that she can read already and can write and is very smart and that kind of stuff, but what we really care about is that she's been to a museum before, that she's been to an art exhibit, that she's been exposed to those things. So some kids may not have access to that type of exposure. They may not be able to experience that kind of stuff. So that may improve test performance as well. And here is a video by Crash Course on Controversy of Intelligence. So I suggest that you watch that by going through the PowerPoint on Moodle. Okay, so other factors could be, like I said, most IQ tests are written, administered, scored by white middle-class psychologists. Terms, expressions, knowledge tested might not be familiar to some. And then we have stereotype threat. So this term is a person's expectation may influence how he or she scores. So if I expect to do poorly, I will do poorly. And kind of the main example for this that's used quite a bit is female students with math. So the stereotype that male students are better at math performance than female students, and then you see over time, yes, there is in fact a difference between performance of boys and girls math in school. But the interesting thing is they've done research where they split up boys and girls right off the bat for math classes, and with those studies, performance in math is fairly equal. So the idea there is that there may be stereotype threat of little girls going into math class believing that they won't perform as well as the boys, and then in turn doing poorly because they expect to do poorly, which we kind of saw with the Pygmalion effect too. Just like last time, if you have any questions, comments, you can write them down and bring them up in class on Tuesday. Or I believe our exam is on Tuesday. So you may want to write the questions or comments on the forum or email me, whatever works best for you.